You step into the grand sanctuary of a cathedral in Boston. 2002. The air smells faintly of incense and polished wood. But tonight, it's not mass drawing people. Here it's the weight of revelation. For decades, whispers about priests and children were dismissed, brushed away, or hidden behind stained glass. But now, the secrets have burst into the open. The Boston Globe's spotlight investigation has shaken not just the city, but the entire Catholic Church, exposing a vast scandal of sexual abuse and cover-up. This is not just one man or one parish. It is a system, decades in the making, where silence became the most powerful sermon. And before we wander too deep into shadows, let me gently welcome you. You found your way to 102 Hours, where true crime and mysteries are explored in a softer voice, an invitation more than a command. If you're new here, consider letting your finger tap that little subscribe button so these stories find you again. And as always, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it in your world right now? I love seeing the tiny map of our listeners glowing across continents. So settle in, perhaps dim your lights, let your body loosen into the chair or bed where you are. Because tonight, we walk slowly into one of the most far-reaching scandals of modern history. The Catholic Church scandal, decades of silence, decades of abuse. The hook is clear because the numbers are staggering. Reports in 2002 revealed more than 130 priests in the Boston Archdiocese had been accused of abusing minors, with accusations stretching back decades. That's not just an isolated failure, that's an institution. You sit with that knowledge, your jaw tightening as you realize how many Sunday mornings and weekday confessions carried unspoken dangers. It feels like the betrayal cuts deeper because the church was not just any authority, was supposed to be sacred. One undeniable fact anchors this moment in history. Cardinal Bernard Law, once one of the most powerful figures in American Catholicism, resigned in December 2002 after public outrage over his role in covering up abusive priests. His downfall symbolized the collapse of trust, not only in Boston but across the Catholic world. But then comes a detail you might not expect. In the aftermath of the spotlight revelations, bookstores in Boston reported a sudden surge in sales of thick parish directory stows, plain, little books listing every priest, every parish, every assignment. Ordinary parishioners were combing through them, trying to piece together which priests had been shuffled where, and whether their own childhood memories suddenly looked different in this new, darker light. It's a quirky image, rows of directories selling out like bestsellers. Yet behind it is desperation. People wanting to confirm whether the whispers they'd ignored for years had been true all along. From the very beginning, the scandal's reach was clear. Journalists uncovered how priests were quietly transferred from one parish to another whenever accusations surfaced. Families were persuaded to keep silent, often told it was for the good of the church, or that the priest was simply sick and would recover after treatment. Investigators still question whether some bishops fully understood the scale of the abuse, or whether they convinced themselves their decisions were acts of mercy. Either way, the outcome was the same. Children were left unprotected, and you, as the listener, can feel that tension, how something that should have been holy became a mechanism for harm. That's why this case matters, why it demands your attention. It isn't just about faith, or even about crime. It's about trust. Who earns it, who abuses it, and what happens when silence is allowed to take root for too long. So, here in Section 1, we begin where the glass finally cracked. The Boston revelations turned a city upside down and opened a global reckoning that still echoes 20 years later. And tonight, as you lean back and let your breathing slow, You'll carry those whispers with you through shadows, across oceans, and into the hidden corners of power where silence once reigned. You sit in the back row of a parish hall meeting sometime in the late 1980s. Parents murmur in low voices, the kind that carry both worry and obedience. Something has happened again, though no one dares say it outright. A priest has been reassigned. That's the word that gets whispered, as if a transfer to another parish is the solution to everything. You watch as the culture of silence wraps around the room like incense smoke, thick, cloying, difficult to escape. In those years, the Catholic Church operated with an extraordinary level of authority, especially in strongholds like Boston, Dublin, and Melbourne. To question a priest felt like questioning God, and if a family suspected abuse, the first impulse was often to call the bishop, not the police. The result: allegations were handled quietly, internally, with decisions made behind closed doors. The pattern became familiar. Remove the priest from one parish, send him to a treatment center, then quietly assign him somewhere else. One historical fact marks this clearly. In 1985, Father Gilbert Goeth of Louisiana became one of the first US priests publicly prosecuted for abusing children. His conviction made national news, yet instead of inspiring a sweeping cleanup, church leaders doubled down on secrecy. Rather than expose abusers, many dioceses worked harder to shield them, hoping to avoid lawsuits and scandal. And here's a quirky detail. Some bishops actually kept what they called secret archives, locked filing cabinets inside chancery offices. These were literal closets or safes, where records of allegations, psychiatric evaluations, and transfers were stored. Only the bishop and his closest advisors had the keys. In one diocese, a priest joked darkly that it was easier to get access to the Vatican library than to those metal drawers in the corner office. The logic of silence extended to parishioners, too. Many families, overwhelmed by shame, chose not to speak out at all. Some worried they wouldn't be believed. Others feared ostracism from their own faith community. And some truly thought the church would handle it with pastoral care. That's how silence became cyclical, every unspoken word reinforcing the next. As you listen, you feel the weight of how everyday choices built this culture. The priest who looked the other way, the nun who told a crying child to say more prayers, the parishioner who heard rumors and shrugged them off as gossip. Each one small, almost invisible. But together, they formed a shield around abusers that seemed impenetrable. Investigators still question whether church leaders of that era truly believed they were protecting victims by avoiding scandal, or whether they were simply protecting the institution, perhaps both. Either way, the culture of silence did not grow accidentally. It was nurtured, watered with fear, obedience, and misplaced loyalty. It is easy to forget how deeply ingrained that silence was. Picture this. In Ireland, children at industrial schools reported abuse to local Garda officers, only to be driven back to the school gates and told to behave. In Boston, when parents complained to their parish, they often received polite letters from the chancery assuring them that appropriate action had been taken, while the same priest was already unpacking boxes in a new parish across town. The silence stretched not just across years, but across oceans. It created a transnational pattern where the same methods of concealment cropped up from one continent to another. Treatment centers for priests with moral lapses became almost routine. Diocesan lawyers quietly coached bishops on minimizing liability. Insurance companies encouraged settlements with strict confidentiality clauses. The machine ran smoothly, and the fewer people who spoke, the more efficiently it ran. And you, sitting in that parish hall in your imagination, can sense the tragedy of it all. The people there loved their church. They trusted it. And yet their trust became the very fuel that allowed the silence to endure. By the late 1990s, a handful of voices were breaking through, advocates, journalists, and above all, survivors, refusing to remain invisible. But for decades before that, the silence was nearly absolute. The culture of silence was not just a background detail of the scandal. It was the very stage on which the abuse continued, decade after decade. It shaped how families responded, how bishops acted, and how the truth remained hidden until it finally erupted in full public view. As this section closes, you feel the hush of that parish hall once more. The whispers have quieted, but the culture that produced them lingers. Silence was not a lack of words, it was a choice, and a devastatingly powerful one. You sit with the thought of a child in the 1970s, clutching a hymn book too tightly, hoping the pages might offer some shield. But the shadows in those sanctuaries were long, and children often disappeared into them metaphorically, emotionally, sometimes physically. For years, victims of clerical abuse lived not only with trauma, but with the crushing silence imposed by the very communities that should have sheltered them. You imagine yourself in their shoes, small and unheard, while the walls of the parish carried every secret like echoes that refused to fade. When you lean closer to this part of the story, you realize the sheer scale of the suffering. Official reports later revealed that in Ireland's industrial and reform schools, tens of thousands of children endured abuse that went unchecked for decades. The Ryan Report of 2009 documented horrors stretching back to the 1930s, with survivors describing beatings, sexual assaults, and systematic neglect. These were not isolated cases, but patterns, woven into the very fabric of institutions meant to raise and protect children. And then comes a quirky, almost unbelievable detail. In one Irish school, children were punished not just for speaking out, but even for crying at night. Staff believed tears were a sign of weakness, and so a sobbing child might be beaten simply for letting grief escape. The cruelty extended beyond the abuse itself, punished the very human instinct to seek comfort. Imagine trying to survive when even your own tears were deemed unacceptable. Victims were left in shadows because the systems around them functioned like blackout curtains. Police officers sometimes dismissed allegations as parents, bound by religious loyalty, urged silence. Teachers ignored bruises, while medical professionals occasionally wrote vague reports that avoided pointing fingers. You, sitting quietly as you listen, can almost hear the layered silences stacking up one on top of the other until the truth became suffocated. One historical fact illustrates the depth of the problem. In 1992, Father James Porter, a Massachusetts priest, was convicted of abusing 28 children. By the time of his trial, more than 130 people had come forward with accusations. Yet for years before his conviction, Porter had been quietly moved between parishes, even after repeated complaints. Survivors later said they felt like their pain had been filed away in drawers that no one would open until it was far too late. And this leads to the difficult reflection. Investigators still question whether certain bishops or superiors truly failed to recognize the damage victims carried, or whether they chose not to look because the consequences for the church would have been too severe. Either way, the children remained unseen, their cries muffled by layers of adult decisions. What strikes you as you follow this thread is how victims often internalized the silence. Many did not come forward until decades later, after marriages, after raising children of their own, sometimes even after retirement. Trauma sat in the body like a dormant fire, smoldering for decades. Survivors described panic attacks triggered by hymns, by the smell of incense, by the sound of a church bell. For some, entering a church as adults was impossible. It was like walking back into a crime scene. In Boston, when the Globe's Spotlight team finally published its findings in 2002, phone lines were flooded with calls from survivors who had waited years to be believed. Some spoke shakily, others with fury, but most with relief. At last, they were not alone. The silence that had bound them had finally cracked. One survivor from Pennsylvania later recalled how she would sit outside her parish as a teenager, notebook in hand, writing down every detail of what had happened to her, but never daring to tell another soul. Decades later, that notebook became her evidence in the grand jury investigation. You picture her hands trembling as she opened those old pages, every word a reminder of pain she once locked away. The shadows where victims were left were not just physical places, they were social and spiritual. Survivors often described feeling abandoned by God, even cursed. Some turned away from faith entirely, unable to reconcile the sanctuary of their childhood with the trauma it contained. Others clung to prayer but redirected their faith toward resilience, insisting that their pain would not define the rest of their lives. A listener like you can feel how those hidden lives shaped the broader scandal. Without survivors' voices, the abuse would have remained invisible. Their testimony turned whispers into roars, forcing courts, governments, and even the Vatican to confront what had been ignored. But before that reckoning came, there were long years of shadows, filled with silence, fear, and endurance. You close your eyes and imagine those countless children, now adults, still carrying memories carved too deep to fade. Their courage in breaking the silence reshaped history, but for far too long, they were left unseen. You picture a desk inside a bishop's office. The wood is polished, the cross hangs above, and in the bottom drawer lies a folder no parishioner was ever meant to see. For decades, the Catholic Church kept meticulous records, letters of complaint, psychiatric evaluations, lists of transfers. But these papers were buried, hidden in locked cabinets, or euphemistically titled secret archives. If you trace the scandal's timeline, you quickly see that the abuse was not only physical, it was also bureaucratic. The Church's paper trail, carefully guarded, told a story that no one wanted exposed. One historical fact grounds this truth. During the Boston trials in 2002, court documents revealed how the archdiocese had tracked every allegation, often in detail. Internal memos described priests as a serious risk, yet still recommended reassignment rather than removal. These papers weren't rumors or exaggerations, they were the institution's own handwriting, preserved but sealed. And then comes the quirky detail. Some dioceses used color-coded index cards to keep track of problem priests. Imagine that for a moment. Lives reduced to filing system symbols. A red mark might mean allegations of abuse. A green one suggested the priest was in recovery, and yellow hinted at needs supervision. It's the kind of organizational trick you'd expect in a library, not in records of human suffering. But there they were, slips of color-coded bureaucracy tucked into drawers that almost no one could access. You lean into this realization, sensing how the concealment worked. Bishops would consult these files, discuss with lawyers, and decide on transfers. The paperwork grew thicker each year, but it rarely left the chancery walls. Families who begged for answers were often told no records existed, when in fact their letters had been filed away in folders stamped confidential. The irony is sharp. The Church prided itself on order, on meticulous record-keeping, and that very order became the mechanism of secrecy. Investigators still question whether church leaders kept such detailed files out of prudence, so they could track patterns and know who needed watching, or whether they maintained them purely to protect the institution in case lawsuits arrived. After all, records can cut both ways. They prove knowledge, but they also provide a shield if controlled tightly enough. There is one more unsettling image. During legal proceedings, lawyers discovered that some dioceses periodically cleaned their archives. That didn't mean shredding every file, but it often meant removing incriminating notes or rephrasing memos in softer, vaguer language. Instead of credible allegations of abuse, a file might be updated to read boundary issues. Instead of sexual misconduct, it might become inappropriate relationships. Words were polished like stones until their sharp edges dulled. This isn't just theory. In 2003, the Archdiocese of Boston released nearly 11,000 pages of internal documents under court order. Survivors, journalists, and parishioners poured through them, stunned at how detailed the records were. There were notes of parents' phone calls from decades earlier. There were psychiatric reports warning about recidivism risk. There were letters from bishops thanking priests for cooperation, even after abuse had been reported. The paper trail wasn't an accident. It was a shadow history, parallel to the public story the Church told its faithful. You might find it haunting that such careful records existed but were buried. In one Massachusetts case, a victim's family wrote multiple letters to the diocese, begging for help. Each letter was preserved in a file. Decades later, when the file surfaced, the handwriting of desperate parents stared back at investigators, a silent witness across time. Even the Vatican was part of this buried archive. By canon law, bishops were instructed to keep secret files under lock and key. The 1983 Code of Canon Law specifically allowed for documents of moral matters to be stored in restricted archives. It was standard procedure, but in practice, it meant allegations of abuse could be legally hidden from both parishioners and civil authorities. Now you can almost hear the scratch of pens across paper, the click of filing cabinets closing, the thud of a safe door shutting. It's all administrative, mundane, even boring. Yet within those bureaucratic sounds lay the fates of thousands of children. You sit back and notice how paper, usually so fragile, became powerful here. Fragile sheets, locked behind doors, carried more weight than spoken testimonies. Victims' voices were drowned out, but their stories lived quietly in drawers, waiting for the day when subpoenas would break the locks. It's strange to think so many scandals are lost to history because no records survive. But here, the tragedy was, doubledricks existed, but no one acted on them. That's the cruel paradox of the Catholic Church scandal. The paper trail didn't disappear. It was buried in plain sight. You sit at a newsroom desk in Boston, January 2002. The clatter of keyboards is steady, the air dry with coffee and anticipation. The Boston Globe's Spotlight team has been piecing together threads for months' court filings. Whispers from attorneys, reluctant sources. At first glance, it looks like a handful of cases, but as the Spotlight reporters cross-check the paper trail, the magnitude expands. What seemed like a local scandal starts to look systemic, almost global. You feel the weight of it as if you're right there, leaning over the piles of manila folders stacked high on a tired wooden desk. The story that broke in January 2002 didn't just rattle Boston. It sent shockwaves through the entire Catholic Church. The investigation revealed that Cardinal Bernard Law, Archbishop of Boston, had knowingly reassigned abusive priests for decades. Complaints from parents had been documented. Concerns from parishioners had been filed, Yet priests were shuffled like chess pieces. And this wasn't just one priest, it was dozens. One historical fact anchors this moment. The Spotlight team eventually identified nearly 90 priests in the Boston Archdiocese accused of abusing children. Here's the quirky detail. During their reporting, the Spotlight journalists relied on stacks of old Catholic directories, essentially yearbooks for priests. By flipping through editions year after year, they tracked where each priest had been assigned. Patterns emerged. Priests suddenly transferred without explanation. Priests sent to sick leave, only to reappear in another parish. It was like playing detective with a church phone book, turning mundane reference books into a map of decades-long concealment. You lean closer, feeling the adrenaline of discovery. Each time the team connected dots, the circle widened. The silence you heard in earlier sections, the buried files you imagined in chancery safes, were now dragged into daylight. Survivors began calling the globe in waves, telling stories they had carried for 20, 30, even 40 years. Some had never spoken to anyone before. The newsroom became a confessional. Except this time, the listeners weren't priests but reporters, notebooks open, ears sharp. The Globe's series didn't only confirm abuse, it showed the institution's pattern of concealment. Cardinal Law eventually resigned in December 2002 under enormous public pressure. But the resignation, while dramatic, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a cascade. Other dioceses across the US, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Chicago, came under scrutiny. And as investigations spread overseas, it became clear this was not a Boston problem. This was a global one. Investigators still question whether the full scope of the Boston revelations would have surfaced without the unusual persistence of the Spotlight team. After all, many journalists before them had touched the edges of the story, only to move on. What made the difference here was focus, stamina, and timing. The team didn't let go, and once the reporting hit front pages, the floodgates opened. The public reaction was volcanic. Parishioners who had tithed faithfully for years were suddenly questioning where their money went. Attendance dropped. Trust collapsed. Lawsuits surged. Insurance companies panicked. The Catholic Church, one of the world's oldest and most resilient institutions, found itself in a legitimacy crisis. And you, as the listener in this midnight retelling, feel the ripple of that moment. Because if the first 4 sections painted silence and shadows, this one is the crack of thunder splitting the sky. It's the fire sparked by Spotlighter, fire that spread across continents, illuminating truths that had long been hidden. Survivors described reading the Globe articles and weeping, not only because their pain was finally acknowledged, but because they realized they weren't alone. What they thought were isolated tragedies turned out to be part of a vast pattern. In that realization, grief met solidarity, and solidarity became power. Even Hollywood later recognized the impact. In 2015, the film Spotlight dramatized the story, winning Best Picture at the Oscars. But as you remind yourself, the real drama wasn't in award shows, it was in the lives changed by the reporting. Survivors who had spent decades in silence finally saw the institution shaken to its core. The fire lit in Boston did not burn out. It spread, sparking inquiries in Ireland, Australia, Germany, and beyond. It forced the Vatican to confront its own role. It led to financial settlements totaling billions. Most of all, it gave survivors a stage on which to speak without being drowned out. As this section closes, you picture the newsroom again. The reporters look tired, worn down by months of sifting through paper, knocking on doors, and listening to unbearable stories, but you also see resolve. Their work didn't just win awards, it changed the course of history, and you, sitting with their story now, can still feel the heat of the fire they lit, a fire that spread across the world, burning through decades of silence and abuse. You lean forward into the story and see the figure of Cardinal Bernard Law, tall and solemn, his red vestments gleaming under the cathedral lights. For decades, he was Boston's spiritual leader, a powerful man with direct ties to the Vatican. Parishioners once saw him as unshakable, almost untouchable. But behind the grandeur, documents and testimonies revealed a leader who quietly shifted priests from one parish to another, even when allegations of abuse were staring him in the face. What you follow now, isn't just a scandal of priesthood, the unraveling of a cover-up at the very top of the archdiocese. A historical fact underscores the weight of this chase. In 2002, court records showed that Cardinal Law had been personally informed of multiple abuse allegations, including those against notorious priest John Gahane. Instead of removing Gahane from ministry, Law reassigned him to another parish, where further abuse occurred. The outrage was not only about the abuse itself, but about the institutional decision to protect clergy rather than children. And here's the quirky, almost surreal detail. In some of the letters uncovered, bishops wrote about abusive priests as though they were struggling employees, rather than criminals. One memo even described a priest as a candidate for reassignment after a period of rest, as if what was needed after assaulting children was a sabbatical, not prison. You imagine the cold absurdity of those words, typed neatly on diocesan letterhead, filed away as if they were HR paperwork instead of evidence of crimes. The chase after Law's accountability wasn't simple. Protesters gathered outside the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, carrying placards that read "Protect children, not priests." Survivors stood in the snow, demanding his resignation. The press hounded him with questions at every turn. And yet, for months, Law resisted. He issued statements of sorrow, but insisted he hadn't understood the full scope of the crisis. You feel the tension in those months, as if watching a dam creak under pressure. Investigators still question whether Law acted out of willful blindness or deliberate concealment. Did he underestimate the scale of abuse, or did he know and choose to protect the Church's reputation above all else? Either way, the effect was the same. Children remained in danger, and victims were denied justice. The cover-up wasn't just about Law himself, it was systemic. Files showed multiple bishops and auxiliary leaders signing off on transfers, reviewing reports, and agreeing to silence. Lawyers for survivors argued that the archdiocese had essentially run a conspiracy of concealment, ensuring predators could operate without interference from law enforcement. And when survivors' lawsuits mounted, church attorneys fought aggressively to keep documents sealed, to protect not only Law but the wider institution. You picture the courtroom moments. Survivors taking the stand, their voices trembling, lawyers presenting the documents, memos, transfer letters, psychiatric notes as if stacking bricks in a wall of evidence. Each paper added weight until the wall towered over Law's public denials. For many survivors, it was the first time their pain was formally acknowledged, not brushed aside with prayers and platitudes. The public pressure grew unbearable. By December 2002, Law resigned, fleeing Boston for Rome. There, he was appointed archpriest of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, one of the great papal churches. To many survivors, it felt like exile disguised as promotion. You imagine their frustration. After years of silence and abuse, The man at the center of concealment was rewarded with a position in the Vatican. Another historical note lingers. Law never faced criminal charges. While civil lawsuits against the archdiocese resulted in enormous settlements, Law himself remained legally untouched. That fact alone deepened survivors' sense of injustice. They saw priests go to trial, dioceses paid damages, but the cardinal who presided over it all lived comfortably in Rome until his death in 2017. You might find yourself shaking your head at the irony. On the one hand, Law's resignation was unprecedented, a powerful cardinal forced to step down under public pressure. On the other hand, his comfortable Vatican role became a symbol of how the Church protected its hierarchy even amid scandal. Survivors often described it as justice without accountability. There's another quirky detail buried in survivor accounts. When Law moved to Rome, some local tour guides reportedly avoided mentioning his name during basilica tours, fearing it would upset visitors. Imagine that his presence so controversial that even guides in a city steeped in history preferred silence. It's a small but telling echo of the larger cover-up. His name itself became something to step carefully around. As you rest in this section, the pattern is clear. The chase after Law's cover-up wasn't just about exposing one man. It was about pulling the veil off an entire system where silence was policy, where reputation outweighed truth, and where even the highest authorities could evade earthly justice. You close this moment with the image of survivors standing outside churches, candles in hand, determined that their pain would not be buried again. The cover-up may have stretched decades, but their persistence ensured it would be remembered and judged in the light of history. You step quietly into a courthouse hallway. The marble floors echo under soft footsteps. The air smells faintly of paper and coffee, and you can feel the tension that lingers in the walls. This is where the Catholic Church scandal, long buried in parishes and chancery offices, is forced into the light of secular law. Courtrooms across the United States became stages where survivors told their stories. Lawyers clashed with bishops, representatives, and judges wrestled with how to balance faith, law, and justice. You are no longer in the hushed sanctuaries of churches. You are in the sharp glare of legal proceedings. One historical fact grounds this moment. In the early 2000s, civil lawsuits and criminal prosecutions surged after the Boston revelations. In Massachusetts alone, more than 500 victims came forward, leading to an $85 million settlement in 2003 with the Archdiocese of Boston. Across the US, dioceses eventually paid over $3 billion in settlements. These were not symbolic amounts, they were record-shattering payouts, reflecting both the scale of abuse and the institution's desperate attempt to limit further exposure. But money wasn't the only currency of justice. In criminal courts, individual priests were finally held accountable. John Gahane, perhaps the most infamous name from Boston, was convicted in 2002 of indecent assault and battery on a 10-year-old boy. He was sentenced to prison, where he would later be killed by another inmate in 2003. His death shocked many not only because of its violence, but because it seemed like a grim footnote to a tragedy that was already unbearable. Here's the quirky detail that might make you pause. Some defense attorneys for priests argued that the statute of limitations had expired, meaning too much time had passed to legally prosecute. In court, this led to surreal moments where judges listened to lawyers debate not whether abuse had occurred, but whether it could still legally count. Survivors described the experience as sitting in a time machine that ignored their pain simply because the calendar had turned too many pages. You sit inside one of those courtrooms in your imagination. Survivors take the stand, their voices shaking but steady. They describe stolen childhoods, years of silence, the crushing weight of shame. Some bring photographs from the time, holding up evidence of innocence lost. The priests on trial often sit quietly in clerical collars, their lawyers speaking for them. The contrast is stark. One side fragile but raw with truth, the other side cloaked in legal strategies. Investigators still question whether the church fully cooperated with civil authorities during these trials. While some dioceses eventually turned over documents, others fought subpoenas fiercely. Critics argued that the church's legal defenses were designed not just to protect finances, but to store long enough for statutes of limitations to expire. Even when judges ordered files released, lawyers sometimes redacted entire pages, leaving survivors staring at black ink where answers should have been. Still, progress happened. In Philadelphia, grand jury investigations in 2005 documented decades of abuse by more than 60 priests. In Los Angeles, Cardinal Roger Mahony agreed to release thousands of pages of priest personnel files in 2013 after years of resistance. Each courtroom battle chipped away at the silence, one file, one testimony at a time. You might think of these trials as exhausting marathons. Survivors sometimes waited years for resolution. Court calendars dragged. Hearings were postponed. And yet, many returned again and again, determined that their stories would be on the record. A few even described the act of testifying as cathartic, painful, but necessary, like lancing a wound so it could finally heal. The imagery of confession is unavoidable here. Inside Catholic churches, confession is private, whispered in dim booths, absolution given by a priest. But in courtrooms, confession took another form. Sworn testimony under oath, recorded by stenographers, judged by juries. Survivors flipped the script. Instead of confessing sins to priests, they exposed priests' sins to the world. And here is another quirky, almost ironic tidbit. Some survivors described judges offering tissues or pausing proceedings when emotions ran high, gestures that felt more pastoral than what they had received from church leaders years earlier. For many, it was a reversal of roles, the court showing compassion, while the church had once shown indifference. As you sit with this section, you notice how the atmosphere of courtrooms differs from chapels. Both have rituals, both have rules, both ask participants to stand and sit at prescribed times. But only in court did survivors feel their voices carried legal weight. Only in court did the silence break in a way that could not be undone. When verdicts were read, some survivors wept openly. Others sat still, faces blank, as if unsure how to process justice so long denied. For them, justice was imperfect. No trial could return childhoods or erase scars. But each conviction, each settlement, each confession in court marked a shift. The abuse was no longer whispered rumor. It was established fact, spoken into microphones, etched into legal records. You leave the courtroom with the sound of a gavel echoing in your mind. The noise is sharp, decisive, unlike the vague promises survivors had heard from bishops in earlier decades. A gavel strike may be small, but in this story, it was thunderous. It was the sound of accountability, however delayed, finally breaking through the cathedral silence. You close your eyes and suddenly you're no longer in Boston. You're in Dublin, Ireland, where the sound of church bells once marked the rhythm of daily life. Yet in the early 2000s, those bells tolled against a background of suspicion and sorrow. The revelations from the United States sparked something across the Atlantic, a wave of inquiries, reports, and courtroom battles that showed the Catholic Church scandal wasn't here confined to one city or even one country. It was global. A historical fact underscores this moment. In Ireland, the 2009 Ryan Report and Murphy Report uncovered decades of systemic abuse in schools and parishes. These weren't isolated cases. They detailed thousands of children subjected to neglect and violence in church-run institutions, sometimes with the state's knowledge. The reports were hundreds of pages long, filled with testimonies that mirrored those already heard in Boston. Silence, cover-ups, and pain that spanned generations. Now shift your attention south to Australia. In 2013, the Australian government launched a royal commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Over 5 years, it heard more than 8,000 testimonies and produced one of the most sweeping investigations of its kind. The commission found that 7% of priests in Australia between 1950 and 2010 had been accused of abuse. Imagine that number, 7 in every 100. Enough to make the pews themselves feel poisoned. Here's a quirky, almost chilling detail from that royal commission. Some dioceses admitted they had deliberately destroyed records of accused priests to avoid scandal. Shredded files, vanished documents, the literal erasure of history. Survivors later said that learning about those shredders was nearly as painful as the abuse itself, because it meant someone made a conscious choice to obliterate their truth. You travel again, this time to Germany. In 2018, a church-commissioned report revealed that 1,670 priests had been accused of sexually abusing more than 3,600 children since 1946. The numbers were staggering. Investigators still question whether the true figures might be even higher, since records were inconsistent and many cases went unreported. The German bishops publicly apologized, but apologies rang hollow to those who had begged for justice for decades. Then, to Chile. In 2010, abuse allegations against Father Fernando Cadima, once a highly influential priest, sparked protests and outrage. The Vatican eventually laced him in 2018. But the scandal went further. It exposed how bishops and even cardinals had defended Cadima for years. Despite knowing the accusations, in 2018, Pope Francis summoned all of Chile's bishops to Rome. In an unprecedented move, every single one of them offered their resignation. Though not all were accepted, the gesture itself was seismic. A recognition that the rot wasn't in one parish, but throughout the hierarchy. As you drift from country to country, the pattern grows undeniable. The scandal wasn't uniquely American. It was woven into the very fabric of the global church. Survivors in Canada, France, Poland, and beyond echoed the same stories. Secrecy, transfers, and betrayal by trusted figures. Each revelation added another country to the map of silence turned into testimony. Now imagine this quirky snapshot. In France, after a 2021 report revealed that 330,000 children had likely been abused in the church since 1950, some parishes held public services of repentance. At one, priests processed barefoot through the aisles as a sign of humility, while survivors sat in the pews, skeptical but watching. The symbolism was haunting bare feet on cold stone, a gesture meant to say, "We are humbled now." For some, it felt too little, too late. For others, it was the first crack in the church's armor of denial. The global reverberations weren't only about statistics and reports. They reshaped how societies viewed institutions of power. Governments passed stricter mandatory reporting laws. Police forces became less hesitant to investigate priests. Journalists in far-flung countries began asking questions that before Boston might have been unthinkable. survivors found solidarity across borders. An Irish survivor might write to an Australian survivor, realizing their stories aligned almost perfectly despite being oceans apart. You pause and realize how interconnected the world had become through these revelations. Silence had been global, but now, so was the breaking of silence. Of course, the Vatican could not ignore the tremors. Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis each addressed the crisis in different ways, with Francis in particular calling for zero tolerance. Yet critics argued that progress was slow, and that real accountability, especially for bishops and cardinals, remained elusive. And so you end this section with a map in your mind, dots scattered across continents. Each dot is a survivor, each survivor a story, each story part of a pattern that took decades to emerge. From Boston to Dublin, Sydney to Santiago, Munich to Paris. The reverberations of the Catholic Church scandal have shaken the world in ways no single courtroom could contain. You picture the Vatican at dawn, the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square slick from the night's mist. Pilgrims gather, cameras raised, while the dome of the basilica glows softly in the rising sun. On the surface, it's timeless serenity, yet behind those ornate walls, pressure is mounting. For centuries, the Vatican projected power and certainty, but in the wake of abuse revelations, its fortress-like image is cracking. Silence, once its weapon, has become its liability. A historical fact grounds this section. In 2001, Pope John Paul II ordered all abuse cases worldwide to be reported to the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, under Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. That directive centralized power in Rome, but it also meant the Vatican now had direct knowledge of thousands of cases. By the time Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI in 2005, the mountain of files was impossible to ignore. Benedict did something unusual for a pope. He met personally with survivors. In 2008, during his trip to the United States, he sat in private with a small group, prayed with them, and expressed sorrow. It was unprecedented, yet critics said words without action fell short. Lawsuits still revealed the Vatican fighting to shield itself from liability in US courts, arguing it was a sovereign state immune from such claims. Survivors felt the contradiction: compassion in private, resistance in public. Here's the quirky detail. In some court filings, lawyers for the Vatican argued that priests were technically independent contractors, not employees of the Holy See. The phrase sounded like something from a gig economy app, not the world's oldest continuous religious institution. Survivors described the argument as both absurd and insulting, like hearing the church compare priests to freelance plumbers. The Vatican's pressure increased under Pope Francis. Elected in 2013, he promised zero tolerance and created the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Yet critics pointed out the commission lacked real power. Some survivors who served on it resigned, frustrated that their recommendations were ignored. Investigators still question whether the Vatican's reforms are genuine efforts at change or calculated gestures to calm outrage while maintaining control. Consider Chile again, when Francis initially defended Bishop Juan Boros, accused of covering up Caridima's abuse. He dismissed survivors' claims as calumny. The backlash was fierce, forcing Francis to reverse course, admit he had made grave errors, and accept some bishops' resignations. That episode showed how global pressure could force even the Pope to change his stance, but also how slow the Vatican could be to listen. Inside the Vatican itself, debates simmer. Some cardinals push for transparency, Others cling to secrecy. Files once locked in dusty archives now risk exposure by civil authorities demanding cooperation. You imagine the hushed corridors, the shuffle of cassocks, the whispers in Latin men accustomed to controlling history suddenly cornered by it. Another historical note. In 2019, Pope Francis abolished the pontifical secret in abuse cases, a confidentiality rule that had long been used to justify withholding information. It was a symbolic step, but survivors asked, if secrecy is lifted, why are so many documents still hidden? Why are bishops who enabled abuse still in positions of power? And then there's the image of the Vatican's press briefings. Spokesmen deliver carefully worded statements. Reporters raise hands with sharp questions. Cameras flash. The tension is visible. It's no longer a church issuing pronouncements from above. A church being interrogated by the world. The balance has shifted. Here's another quirky tidbit. When Francis convened bishops for a summit on abuse in 2019, he ended one speech with a list of 21 reflection points. Some observers said it felt more like a corporate seminar than a reckoning with crimes against children. Survivors watching live streams from Rome rolled their eyes, PowerPoint-style bullet points in the face of decades of trauma. You linger on the pressure itself. It's not only legal or financial, it's spiritual. For believers worldwide, trust in the Vatican has been deeply shaken. Donations dropped in some dioceses. Seminaries saw declining enrollments. In countries like Ireland, once fiercely Catholic, mass attendance plummeted after the abuse revelations. The Vatican isn't just defending itself in courtrooms, it's fighting for relevance in the hearts of its flock. Investigators still question whether the Vatican, with its centuries-old structures and guarded hierarchies, is even capable of the radical transparency survivors demand. Can an institution built on secrecy transform into one defined by accountability? Or will it forever be caught between apology and self-preservation? As you rest in this section, you sense the weight pressing down on the Vatican. The marble walls may stand strong, but the voices outside survivors, journalists, governments, and ordinary Catholics are louder than ever. The Vatican is under pressure, and this time it cannot simply wait for silence to return. You lean back, close your eyes, and imagine the hush of a press room before the microphones crackle to life. This time, though it isn't bishops or Vatican spokesmen taking the podium, it's survivors. For decades, their voices were muffled, dismissed in parishes, ignored in chancery offices, silenced by legal threats. But now, in the aftermath of global revelations, survivors no longer whisper. They stand together, they speak, and the world listens. A historical fact sets the tone. In 2002, the group snapped the survivors' network of those abused by priests gathered outside Boston's Cathedral of the Holy Cross as the scandal broke wide open. Their presence was small at first, a cluster of people holding signs, but their persistence sparked a movement. By the 2010s, Snap chapters had spread internationally, offering hotlines, meetings, and a network of solidarity that outpaced many official church efforts. Survivors no longer had to feel alone. They had community, strategy, and voice. The impact grew louder in Ireland. After the Ryan and Murphy reports, survivors there formed advocacy groups that pushed not only for apologies, but for reparations and state accountability. Their campaigns led to state-run compensation schemes, education reforms, and memorials honoring those who suffered in institutions once cloaked in reverence. Survivors reshaped public policies, something few would have imagined possible during decades of enforced silence. Here's a quirky detail that says much about how survivors flipped the narrative. Some organized silent protests outside churches where accused priests had served. They would stand in absolute silence, holding placards with the names of victims. Parishioners walking in for Mass were forced to pass them, the silence louder than any chant. Reporters covering these protests noted how the absence of sound carried more power than shouts ever could. You picture a survivors' meeting in a community hall. The room is plain. Folding chairs, a coffee pot, stacks of tissues on tables. But the conversations are anything but plain. Stories spill out painful, sometimes broken, sometimes defiant. One person describes how they lost faith entirely. Another explains how they found a new spiritual path outside the church. The range of responses is wide, but the common thread is courage. Each story chips away at the myth that speaking out is impossible. Investigators still question whether the amplification of survivors' voices is fully welcomed within church structures, or whether some officials merely tolerate it under public pressure. At synods and conferences, survivors are sometimes invited to speak, but too often. Their testimonies are allotted only a few minutes, sandwiched between long speeches by clergy. Critics argue this keeps survivors symbolically present but practically sidelined. Still, amplification takes many forms beyond official settings. Survivors publish memoirs, appear in documentaries, and give TED Talks. Each platform broadens the audience, ensuring that future generations will not forget. Consider the 2015 film Spotlight, which dramatized the Boston Globe's reporting. Survivors consulted on the project, and when it won the Oscar for Best Picture, they stood on stage, proved that their voices had reached Hollywood, and through it, millions of homes. Another quirky tidbit: in Poland, where the church remains deeply intertwined with national identity, survivors collaborated with filmmakers to release Tell No One, a YouTube documentary in 2019 that exposed abuse cases. The film went viral, garnering over 20 million views within weeks. Survivors who had long felt ignored by traditional media suddenly found themselves at the center of a national conversation, amplified not by newspapers but by clicks and shares. Amplification isn't only about volume, it's about influence. Survivors lobby lawmakers for stronger child protection statutes. They consult with therapists to design trauma-informed care. Some even train police officers on how to interview victims of institutional abuse. The roles have reversed. Those once silenced now shape the very systems meant to protect future generations. You sit with this thought. Amplification doesn't erase pain, but it transforms it. A voice that once trembled in secrecy now carries weight in parliaments, courthouses, and public squares. Survivors often say they can't change the past, but by speaking, they might change someone else's future. And in ASMR cadence, you hear the rhythm of those voices, steady, insistent, echoing from pulpits they were once barred from. Each testimony is like a pebble dropped into water. The ripples spread across communities, across borders, across generations. The Catholic Church scandal was once framed as a crisis of priests and bishops, but Section 10 shows you the shift. It's also a story of survivors reclaiming agency, pushing past silence, and amplifying their truth until it becomes impossible to ignore. You imagine the echo of footsteps inside a Vatican hall, marble columns rising like sentinels on either side. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of incense and old stone. On paper, this is a place of change, a hub where reform should take root. But in reality, every step forward in addressing the Catholic Church scandal seems to stumble against a wall of resistance. A historical fact grounds the struggle. In 2002, after the Boston scandal erupted, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops adopted the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, often called the Dallas Charter. It introduced mandatory reporting, safe environment programs, and background checks for clergy and lay workers. On the surface, it was a landmark reform, but critics noted one glaring omission: bishops themselves were not held accountable under its provisions. A system meant to protect the vulnerable still shielded those at the very top. Resistance, as you notice, is often subtle. Some dioceses complied only minimally, treating the charter like a box to tick rather than a transformation. Training sessions were held, posters were put up, but survivors wondered, did the culture truly change, or was this just a cosmetic patch over a festering wound? Here's a quirky detail. In certain parishes, safe environment posters were displayed near confessionals, with cartoonish illustrations of smiling children. Survivors pointed out the absurdity: fearful clip art pasted onto walls that had once heard their silent cries for help. It felt like the Church's idea of reform sometimes leaned closer to public relations than to actual healing. As the years passed, reforms expanded globally. In 2019, Pope Francis issued Vos Estis Lux Mundi, a law requiring bishops and religious superiors to report abuse and cover-ups. For the first time, the system acknowledged the role of higher clergy in perpetuating silence. Yet questions immediately surfaced about enforcement. Who investigates a bishop if his peers remain in control? Investigators still question whether these reforms genuinely shift power dynamics, or whether they simply create new paperwork while old patterns remain untouched. Resistance is not only institutional, it's cultural. In countries like Poland, where Catholicism is tightly interwoven with national identity, attempts to hold clergy accountable often meet with fierce backlash. Some bishops frame abuse revelations as attacks on faith itself, urging believers to rally against what they call secular persecution. Survivors who speak out sometimes face harassment from neighbors or family members who see criticism of the Church as betrayal. Contrast that with Germany, where public pressure has forced dioceses to release reports and pay compensation. Yet even there, resistance emerges. Some bishops delay publication, citing legal reviews. Others announce reforms with solemn speeches, but stall when survivors demand access to archives. Transparency, it seems, is always just around the next corner, never fully within reach. Another quirky snapshot: in certain dioceses, penitential services are staged where clergy apologize en masse to parishioners. At one such event in Latin America, bishops distributed small stones to attendees, inviting them to drop the stones into a bowl as a symbol of leaving behind the weight of sin. Survivors attending described the ritual as surreal, like watching a performance where the institution tried to absolve itself with props, while survivors still carried the heavier stones of trauma. You realize reform and resistance move like two dancers locked in a slow, tense waltz. One step forward, new safeguarding officers, independent review boards, papal decrees. One step back, secrecy, non-disclosure agreements, appeals to tradition. For every survivor who feels heard, another reports being silenced anew. There's also financial resistance. Some dioceses declare bankruptcy to manage lawsuit settlements, restructuring their finances in ways that critics say prioritize protecting assets over acknowledging harm. Survivors sometimes receive compensation. Yes, but with the bitter taste that justice came not through moral accountability, but through insurance adjusters and accountants. Still, reforms have undeniable impact. Seminaries now emphasize psychological screening. Lay oversight committees exist where once there was only clerical control. Governments have passed stronger reporting laws, often citing the church scandals as their catalyst. Survivors' pressure has carved changes into stone. Yet resistance lingers like incense, smoke visible, stubborn and choking. You pause and hear the question humming beneath it all. Can an institution as old and vast as the Catholic Church truly reform itself from within? Or will resistance always blunt the edge of change? Investigators still question whether the reforms are genuine revolutions or carefully managed optics designed to protect the Church's image while leaving power structures untouched. The tension remains unresolved, a tug-of-war stretching across continents and decades. And so, in this section, you hold both truths together: reforms that matter, and resistance that weakens them. Survivors, journalists, and believers all wait to see which side will ultimately step ahead in this weary dance. You picture a church on a Sunday morning, sunlight filtering through stained glass, scattering colors across the pews. Families arrive quietly, some clutching rosaries, some simply seeking a moment of peace. And yet, beneath this familiar ritual, the air carries something heavier: trust fractured, faith shaken, and questions unresolved. This is the paradox survivors and believers live with after decades of silence and decades of abuse. A historical fact anchors this moment. In Ireland, once considered one of the most devout Catholic countries in the world, church attendance plummeted in the years following the Ryan and Murphy reports. By 2019, fewer than 1 in 3 Catholics regularly attended Mass. The revelations of systemic abuse didn't just expose crimes, they reshaped the very identity of a nation once built around its parishes. But the paradox isn't only Irish. Across continents, many Catholics left the Church, disillusioned, unwilling to support an institution that failed to protect its children. Others, however, stayed. They argued that faith in God is not the same as faith in bishops. Some even said their spirituality deepened when they separated belief from the flawed structures of the institution. This dual movement exodus and endurance defines the scandal's long shadow. Here's a quirky detail. In some parishes, priests began offering listening sessions where parishioners could vent their anger at the scandal. These sessions sometimes resembled town hall meetings more than spiritual gatherings. People shouted, wept, demanded answers. In one parish, a woman stood up and held her baptismal certificate aloft, declaring, "This piece of paper means nothing to me anymore." The priest, stunned, had no scripted response. You realize that fractured faith doesn't always mean lost faith. Survivors who once avoided church buildings altogether have sometimes returned not to worship, but to reclaim space. Sitting in pews where silence once trapped them, they now speak openly at memorial services or advocacy gatherings. It's an act of defiance as much as devotion. Investigators still question whether the Church's calls for healing are sincere or strategic. Official apologies, rituals of penance, even PayPal visits all can bring comfort, but they can also feel staged. Survivors often point out the gap between gestures and structural change. Healing, they say, can't be scripted in liturgy. It must be lived in accountability. Another historical note: Pope Francis, during his 2018 visit to Ireland, met with survivors and acknowledged that crimes had been covered up. He even prayed for forgiveness in Dublin's Phoenix Park before hundreds of thousands. Yet many survivors criticized the event, calling the apology hollow without firmer action against complicit bishops. The fracture remained, even as faith endured in smaller, quieter ways. And then there are the everyday believers, grandmothers still lighting candles, children still learning prayers, choirs still singing hymns. Their endurance can feel both moving and complicated. Some say they refuse to let abusers steal their faith. Others say remaining in the pews is itself a silent form of protest, a way to demand change from within. A quirky image stays with you. In one German diocese, parishioners began attending Mass wearing small patches on their jackets embroidered with the words, "Wir bleiben, we stay." Not because they were uncritical, but because they wanted to claim their faith community apart from the hierarchy's failures. It was a quiet but powerful symbol of fractured yet enduring belief. You sense the deep tension here. Faith persists, but not unchanged. Some survivors find solace in new spiritual traditions. Some embrace activism as their form of prayer. Others abandon religion altogether, but carry values of compassion and justice into secular life. Endurance, in this sense, isn't always about remaining Catholic. It's about transforming trauma into something that resists silence. At the same time, fractures are visible. Seminaries face dwindling numbers, religious orders shrink, and donations decline. Generational shifts amplify the trend. Younger Catholics are less tied to institutional loyalty and more willing to walk away. The Church's survival, in practical terms, may hinge not only on reform, but on whether it can rebuild credibility with generations raised in the shadow of scandal. Yet here you are, drifting in the hush of narration, holding both truths. The fracture that cut deeply into centuries of tradition, and the endurance that refuses to die out. Survivors' courage, believers' persistence. Even skeptics' questions, all of it weaves into the story of a faith both wounded and alive. The Catholic Church scandal shattered illusions, but it didn't end the search for meaning. Faith fractured, faith enduring. You feel the tension, you hear the voices, and you recognize that this paradox will continue long after tonight. And now, you let the story settle. You've walked through cathedrals filled with whispers, courtrooms echoing with testimony, and communities struggling to reconcile devotion with betrayal. You've listened to survivors who broke decades of silence, to journalists who refused to look away, and to believers who, even in fracture, still light candles in darkened chapels. The Catholic Church scandal, decades of silence, decades of abuse, remains one of the most painful reckonings of modern history. Yet, as you rest here, you notice something quiet beneath the weight, the resilience of the human spirit. Silence was imposed, but silence did not win. You let yourself breathe into that thought. Imagine a survivor stepping out of a courthouse into sunlight, or a parishioner refusing to abandon their faith community despite shattered trust. Both acts, different as they are, carry the same truth. Endurance. People endure. Faith, hope, even doubt, they all find room to live on. A quirky memory surfaces from the story. The silent protests outside churches where words were unnecessary. Just presence, just names, just truth. You carry that image with you into the night. Investigators still question whether full justice will ever arrive, whether every secret archive will be opened, whether every survivor will hear the apology they deserve. Perhaps those answers take more than one lifetime. But tonight, you've heard the echoes of both fracture and endurance, and maybe that's enough to keep your thoughts company as you drift towards sleep. So, close your eyes now. Let the sound of stained glass light, of whispered prayers, of voices finally amplified, soothe you into rest. You've walked through shadows, but you've also touched the glow of resilience.